be happy to share with you some of the things that I've been doing. Basically, in case you haven't figured it out, I'm an Easterner. I've been living in Oklahoma for about 12 years, but I hail from New Jersey. And that's pretty much where I had most of my education. But I got interested in the work of Nikola Tesla at a very young age. I was probably in high school at the time. And I couldn't wait to get into college because my assumption was that I'd be learning all the secrets that the guy didn't have a chance to teach us, and boy was I ever wrong. It turns out that the higher aspects of engineering and the things that I wanted to pursue are not even in the books. But I did struggle through 6 years of college, and after that I got involved with a number of rather big companies across the United States in different capacities as an electrical engineer. One of the best companies I worked for was Bethlehem Steel, and they promptly positioned me up in the northern peninsula of Michigan. And I was stationed there for about 9 years, 8 years, something like that. And it was actually during my sojourn in that area that I made some really interesting discoveries, part of which I owe to problems that we encountered with the engineering at Bethlehem Steel. They were having a lot of difficulties in maintaining a constant power factor with their plant, and they were also very tired of paying enormous bills. And so they asked me if there was anything I could do to trim back on their electrical consumption. And at the time, they were getting ready to scrap a Bucyrus-Erie shovel that had been in service since 1926. It was a very large electrical machine, 4,160 volt potential, and it had an old-fashioned General Electric synchronous motor to run it. And since they were going to scrap it, I went to higher management and I said, look, if you're going to scrap that digging machine, that's your prerogative, but I'd like to have the guts out of it. I'll see what I can do with turning them into something that could be beneficial for your electrical bill here. So they gave me the go-ahead on that, and in the next 3 years I built a synchronous capacitor that had a capacity of about 800,000 VARs, and with that device I was able to knock about 25 to 30% off their electric bill, which was a very sizable bill. But better than that, in the next couple of years after it was in service, I did a lot of experiments at Bethlehem's expense, and I learned some fascinating things, probably a little bit too technical to go into, but basically the bottom line is I learned that energy can, electrical energy that is, can be oscillated in a very novel way right on the power grid. And later I discovered that this was a technique that Tesla had talked about, although he had never published how he did it. And I got so involved in it that I decided that once I had some initial success, I was going to try to miniaturize this discovery and put it into a piece of hardware that I could do something with from a patent point of view. And that work took me quite a few years to accomplish, but I wound up with a generator which I call the Dynaflux alternator. And this device does not have a round armature like most machines that you're probably familiar with, the garden variety motors and generators. It has an elliptical rotor, and it makes use of some very strange and rather obtuse magnetic phenomenon. The net result is that you produce a generating machine which appears to put very little opposition to the process of generating electricity. And so when you turn it with a motor, for instance, the motor doesn't perceive any load, or at least a very small load. with respect to what the generator is producing. So I promptly applied for a patent, and that was somewhere in the early 80s, I forget the exact date. And I had no end of problems with the patent people because of the fact that the things I was advocating were interpreted as violations of the conservation of energy laws. And nonetheless, I battled the establishment, and it took me 6 years or so. And in 1988, I was granted a patent on the device. And I thought, well, here goes, I'll be able to now do something really worthwhile. And at the time, I was working for myself, actually. I had a little marine company called Marine Power and Control. And I was actually building automation systems for tugboats and marine vessels. And I thought that would be the ideal place to start putting these generators, because the good thing about the marine industry is they can't afford long extension cords. They like to have onboard generators. And so I approached various companies with this idea, and they thought it was very nice, but the biggest problem was they weren't going to foot the bill for commercialization. So at that point in time, I started looking for ways to raise several $1 million to fund myself into commercializing what I had discovered. And I found out the hard way just how difficult it is to raise serious money, especially in the United States. And it was around that time that I was introduced to some people that were actually involved with bank debentures and off-balance sheet banking instruments for several of the larger European central banks. And they were the ones who actually opened the doors for me to learn that the Federal Reserve is a privately held corporation. It has nothing to do with the U.S. government. The United States government is actually a privately held corporation that has nothing to do with the United States people, and on and on and on. And it was a very big eye-opener, not to mention the shock involved. But I didn't let it dissuade me from what my goals had become. What I realized, however, was that detaching from the grid is another form of freedom.
Yes.
And the interesting thing is that all aspects of our freedom are greatly curtailed, and we are on a million leashes, not just one. This is true in the food industry, it's true in the medical industry, it's true in the financial industry, it's true in just about every bloody industry. And of course, I could go on and on and on, because I learned a great deal about the way the financial world really works in an attempt to fund my operations. But actually, that's not where I want to go this evening. What I want to continue talking about is the possibility of actually commercializing technologies like the ones that I've been involved with, and also other ones which are known to me, but not necessarily known to the general public. The way the universe is constructed is pretty marvelous, because all secrets are actually out in the open. They always have been. The thing that deters us from realizing how things are actually arranged is our own consciousness. And unfortunately, our consciousness is severely biased by the programming that we receive from the time that we're hatchlings. And the interesting thing is, you talk to the average engineer who has a PhD or a BS degree or a master's, and especially if it happens to be in physics or engineering, and they'll promptly tell you that any kind of a system which could go over unity, which is the expression people like to use these days, would be an absolute violation of the laws of nature, and I'm here to tell you that's absolute rubbish. First of all, there's enough room in this universe for a million different concepts, and our prejudices should not be used to limit the infinite capacity of the Creator. But we do that on a daily basis, so we get away with it. The fact of the matter is that systems which operate over unity don't violate any laws. They just necessitate a re-gauging of the initial systems that we have used to calibrate and determine all the so-called engineering constants that limit us to the things that we're doing now. The interesting thing is that all of those things are variables in the real world, and they can easily, well, not easily, but they can definitely be circumvented or rearranged so that we have new and much more beneficial ways of providing work through the efforts of machinery than what we are currently used to. In fact, the interesting thing is that when you really understand how motors and generators work, and it's taken many years for me to come to this conclusion because it's not something that's actually taught overtly in engineering school, but it's something that you eventually come to grips with after years of toil and study and independent experimentation. The fact of the matter is, there is no difference, or very little difference, between most motors and generators the way they are constructed in the world today. I can take almost any motor and turn it into a generator. I can take any generator and turn it into a motor. And the interesting thing is that when they are running in either capacity, they are doing both. All motors are generating as they spin, and all generators are motoring as they spin. And this is the problem in a nutshell, because the properties of a motor interfere with the properties of a generator, and the properties of a generator interfere with the properties of a motor. And as long as you have an embodiment that's doing both, it's actually fighting itself. So I set out, once I understood this, to demonstrate over a period of years and with several different types of embodiments that you could actually build motors that are incapable of being generators, and generators which are incapable of being motors. And the interesting thing is I've succeeded in doing both of these things, at least to the point of demonstrating it as a viable alternative to what we have. Even though I spent millions of dollars and over 40 years of work to accomplish this, the interesting thing, and perhaps the unfortunate thing, is that it only puts us in a position now where going to the commercialization is possible, but not without the additional assistance of millions of dollars and the intellectual capacity of a lot of brilliant minds. Because there's a very big difference between an operational prototype and the type of commercial device that you can buy at your local hardware store or your local motor shop. Getting from one to the other is an astounding effort. And most people don't realize how much work went into the motors and generators that are in the field today. But the reason why this is worth doing is because it's just another facet of some of the things which are emerging in the modern world. If we stick with oil and gas and all of the other consumables, even if we don't kill ourselves off with the resulting pollution and all the other problems that that engenders, we're eventually going to reach the point where we're going to run out of consumables. And then we're all going to be in a very interesting fix. If we don't revert back to the Stone Age, we'll probably kill each other off, and the elite won't even have to scheme a way to do that. It will happen by itself. Unfortunately, we've been taught that the consumption of fuel is the only way to go, but it definitely is not. Solar is a good example of the fact that you can do something different. Wind power is also worthy of note. But the problem with those two approaches is that they don't supply the energy density that's necessary to sustain and maintain the standard of life that we've become accustomed to, not only in the United States, but in the whole bloody world. The interesting thing about magnetism is that it is a renewable resource on its own. And it exists throughout the universe. It's actually a product of the ether and the currents that flow in the ether, and so if you understand its very basic nature, it can be used in an unbelievably, almost infinite number of ways. And it's always available at our fingertips, providing that you understand the laws that allow it to operate. So, it is my position in life, if you will, and my ultimate goal to bring out this kind of information and make it available. Unfortunately, it's not the type of thing that you can just write a little quick book about and distribute it to everybody in the country and watch the wheels of progress start to spin. It doesn't work that way. Unfortunately, when you are a renegade individual with 40 years of isolated R&D, translating what you know into a language which can be universally accepted and readily understood is not an easy task. And you also have the unfortunate attitude of most PhDs that if they didn't think of it, it can't be right, and if it's doing something that's that radical, it can't be true. So there's a lot to overcome. But the interesting thing is that it isn't the PhDs in the world, and it isn't the elite either, because they're just parasites. It's people like you and me, and everybody gathered in this room, that actually makes the type of progress that the world has enjoyed down through the centuries. The vampires and the leeches of the world just have an exceptional talent for capitalizing on other people's labor and then enslaving the people so that they can milk the thing dry while they live in the lap of luxury. I hate all of that garbage, and I don't even want to go there because it'll change the entire demeanor of what I'm trying to deliver. But the fact of the matter is that we have the power. That's the one good thing about our original government, not the hideous mess we have now, but the original government, which was a democratic republic. It wasn't even a democracy, and I don't think most people know the difference. But the power did reside within the people, and I'm here to tell you that whether it's a new type of generating device, a new type of electric motor, or a new concept involving social reform, all of that stuff can only be brought to reality and embraced by the general public if there's a singular will to do so. And I think one of the biggest false approaches, if you want to call it that we have in America to the destiny of ourselves and our nation is to turn our backs on the problems at hand and say, oh, don't worry, the government will work that out. They will work it out. They'll work it out for themselves and in their best interest, not yours. And that's the real truth of the matter. So, I think it's time, not only with this particular problem, but with all the things that we face as a nation and as a people, and for that matter, as a species, that we start to take the bull by the horns, address the problems, and have something to say about it as individuals, as well as groups, political groups, social groups, people in general. And so in conclusion, and I don't want to drag this on because I could, but it's not really what I intended to do, I just want to say that whether it's the birthing of a new technology or the restoration of a nation that was once the admiration of the entire world, none of that's going to happen unless we get off our backsides and make it happen. And that must mean not just becoming aware of the problems to the most minute detail, but also be willing to sacrifice whatever it takes and to study so that they can't pull the wool over your eyes until you really understand all of the problems. And that way, you know, you don't have to swallow all the BS and assume that they're operating on your behalf, because they're not. It doesn't really take a genius to see that. And so, rather than labor the point, I just want to say that there's lots of alternatives, not just in the energy field, but in medicine, in chemistry, in the food department, in animal husbandry, in biology, everywhere you look. But it takes a special type of mind and a special will to pursue all of these things with the energy and the dedication that it takes to make it happen. And so I challenge all of you to imitate people like Nikola Tesla, who gave his entire life to achieving cheap, reliable electrical power. If we all did that in our own capacities and in every way that we know how to do for the things that interest us individually, we would turn this nation on its head. And we'd have a different country and a different world. So with that, the only thing I can say is I welcome your questions, whether they be technical or otherwise, and I wish you a fine evening. Oh, the elliptical rotor?
The motor's round, but what's elliptical, the magnetic field?
No, the rotor itself is elliptical. If you can picture in your mind a cylinder, a right circular cylinder, and cut through it two slabs at a 45-degree angle with respect to the axis of symmetry, you'll wind up with an ellipse. The interesting thing is, if you put an axle through that ellipse and you spin it, you'll still have the surface area of a portion of a cylinder, but you'll now have a device that wobbles.
Like the Weichel engine?
Yeah, it's better than the Weichel engine.
Is that the one that lost the rotor? Right.
I'm sorry, did
Was
you?
that like the monster rotor?
Well, that's what he was asking. No, it's a very different thing from that. As, if you want to see what it's like, you can just look up my patents or on the internet.
Well, speak, how did you ultimately win out on your patent against the establishment? How did that fight go down? What was the bigger, what part of your argument won out?
Well, actually, with respect to the Dynaflux patent, basically, I just treated it the way you do any patent argument. When you get a refusal from the patent office, you're allowed to have a rebuttal. And so I wrote about 18 rebuttals over a period of about 4 years. And I think they just got sick of listening to it because I knew more about the subject than they did. And I'm not saying that in a brash way or to brag, but if you spend, let's say, 10 years investigating something that nobody else is investigating, if you're not an authority on it, then you're a horse's ass. So,
What was their key points that they were trying to restrict you from doing? Do you remember those?
oh, of course, yeah. I mean, they're talking about the fact that you can't possibly have an electrical system that has the type of overall efficiencies that I was describing, because that would suggest that you're creating energy. But you're not creating energy. As a matter of fact, it's such a nonsensical approach to things that it's mind-boggling. First of all, there's an enormous difference between energy and power. And the people that sell all these so-called energy products never bother to make that distinction. They have just hypnotized everybody to the buzzword of energy. The fact of the matter is they do that for a very specific reason. If you look at the way the finances are arranged, they bill you for kilowatt hours, which is an energy rating. And they do that because the beam counters then have a very easy way of relating tons of coal or oil and the cost of that material to the worth of the final product, even though it happens to be